Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we're going to trace some important traditions from about the 2nd century through the 7th century. We'll start in what's called Hekkelot literature. It's within this literature that we see important early traditions related to Merkavah mysticism. I've prepared this diagram to help us through our study today. Ultimately, as I've said before, the Merkavah mystics were trying to see the vision that Ezekiel and Isaiah saw, so we could continue this diagram backwards in time, but I stopped at the Second Temple period just for convenience. The traditions themselves, we're going to put them no later than the 2nd century CE. We have a relevant recension of Hekkelot material no later than the 3rd century CE, and some of this feeds into what's called the mystical collection. This is a term that David Halperin used in his dissertation, and it refers to 7 units of literature which are attached to the Mishnah. They were appended by the editor of the Tosefta. Some of these re-emerge in both Talmuds, and then we're going to look at a fascinating account in the 7th century about the Queen of Sheba. Now let's talk first about the genre of the traditions and literature that we're dealing with. You can see up here I have exegetical and mystical tradition, i.e. not historical. So as we're going through this, I want you to keep this in mind. For example, we're going to talk about a very famous story in these traditions, sometimes referred to as the story of the 4 who entered paradise. David Halperin notes that Schollem's literalist views, that is, describing actual events, have been criticized by several scholars and particularly convincingly by Urbach. Several decades later, Peter Schaeffer agrees Urbach's interpretation of our text as an allegory with an image, and its application is the most likely one. And once again, from Christopher Moray Jones, in any case, both 4 entered paradise itself and this interpolated section that we'll see later in the Babylonian Talmud are the products of a complex exegetical and mystical tradition, not accounts of actual historical events. At most, you could call them performative exegesis, so you can see now why I've labeled this section of our diagram as such. So let's get into the literature now and see what kind of stories we've been discussing. A certain person was worthy and stood at the gate of the 6th palace, and saw the brilliance of the air, of the stones, and he opened his mouth twice and said, "Water, water." In the blink of an eye they cut off his head, and 11,000 iron cleavers shall be upon him. This tradition is represented by the 3rd block on our diagram. Quite an esoteric story, isn't it? Now, before we talk about the interpretation, let's catch a later version from the Babylonian Talmud. Here we have the 4 who entered paradise, and some of what you're about to hear will sound very familiar. Akiva said, "When you get to stones of pure marble that look like water, don't say water, water, for it is said, he who speaks falsehood shall not be established before my eyes." Then we could continue reading about the 3 who didn't fare so well, and Akiva makes it out in one piece. So what are we seeing in these rather mysterious texts? Well, we're seeing descriptions of tests that are applied to the Merkavah mystics as they're ascending to the throne room. There are several of them, and they're actually quite interesting. When you get to the door of the 6th palace, angels tell you to enter. And if you enter upon the first command, you are not humble, you are inauthentic, you are a fraud, and you will be cast out. So the patient mystic, the worthy mystic, waits until the order enter is repeated a 2nd time, at which point he can enter. Then you're shown polished rock, polished stones, marble, crystal, and it has the appearance of water. If you say it's water, then you've been fooled, and you are exposed as a fraud, and some sort of horrible, gruesome death ensues. Now let's proceed farther down our timeline. We're right here now in the traditions about the Queen of Sheba from the Second Targum of Esther. You may notice some striking similarities. When the King Solomon heard that the Queen of Sheba was coming to him, he arose and went and sat in a glass house. When the Queen of Sheba saw that the king was sitting in a glass house, she considered in her heart and said to herself that the king was sitting in water. So she lifted up her robe to wade across. And we've traced the mystical ascent story through the Hekkelot literature and the Talmud, and you certainly see some parallels here in the Second Targum of Esther, but there's also something rather perplexing. There can be little, if any, doubt that the author based his story on the water vision episode of the Hecalote tradition. It makes no allusion to the traditions about the celestial firmament, nor does it touch on any of the deeper issues and concerns of the Ascent Midrashic tradition. It seems, therefore, that the author simply appropriated the story from the Hecalote tradition and adapted it to his own purpose, perhaps without much understanding of the deeper meaning of the story he was borrowing. Now, adapting this story rather ignorantly in the way that we've just seen isn't really a problem, unless the author of the text who's adapting the story is supposed to be an all-knowing God. Isn't that right, Muslims? Surah 27 of the Quran, it was said to the Queen of Sheba, "Enter the palace. When she saw it, she thought it was a pool of water, and she uncovered her legs. Solomon said, 'Surely it is a polished palace of crystal.' She said, 'My Lord, surely I have done myself evil.'" Just as we saw in the mystical traditions, the same quite conspicuous test was applied to the Queen of Sheba by Solomon. When she thought the polished stone was water, pulled up her robe so that it wouldn't get wet, she was exposed as a fraud. Now we can complete our diagram, adding Surah 27 from the Quran down here in our last block. Jacob Lasner states, "Shorn of all exegesis, verses 15 through 44 of Surah 27 represent a seemingly disjointed account, more reminiscent of an opaque folktale than historical narrative or a didactic midrash based on an ancient and oft-read chronicle. Moreover, the Quran version remains elusive and ahistorical, even after considering the scattered references to Solomon that are found elsewhere in Islamic literature." So we started back here in the mystical traditions and ended here with derivative material the author of the Quran thought was historical, as he included it into the already bloated narrative about Solomon. God, who by definition is all-knowing, could not make such a mistake. We see then that the author of the Quran was not all-knowing. Therefore, contrary to the claims of Muslims, the author of the Quran was not God. Thanks for watching.